Hello guys, Zahir here. I'm going to be talking about Sweet Bobby. I'm going to be answering your questions, which were in my last video, including why. Why would they do this? Big spoilers for Sweet Bobby if you haven't listened to the podcast or watched the documentary. Let's get into it. All right, so question number one is from Fish Cheeks. Thanks very much, Fish Cheeks. And the question is, and it's a good one, how the hell did Simran manage to climb the corporate ladder to become an executive at a large, well-known bank while pretending to be 60 different people on top of having a whole relationship with her own cousin? I need answers, man. I think you and me both. I think the first thing that stands out to me about Simran is that, she was apparently quite intelligent. You'd have to be, if you were going to be selected, to be working at a large financial institution and then working your way up to VP. So she was, apparently head girl. So she was essentially the role model for what other girls should be like at her school. Sounds to me like she was a straight A student. And so this is somebody who's quite competent, and this is something that kind of stood out for me while I was listening to the podcast, is that to pull off something like this, like, you'd have to be quite smart. I don't think it's just a case of sort of sinking hours and time into this. I think there isn't any doubt to me that Simran is a highly intelligent person and also very, very competent. How would she have the time to do this? It sounds to me like she wouldn't be doing anything outside of her personal life besides running these accounts and running this scam. I don't know what her personal life is like, but I'd imagine, you're going to be sacrificing pretty much anything else in your life to do this. It was mentioned in the documentary that was not mentioned in the podcast, which is that Kirat would be with Simran in, say, a coffee shop or something, and Simran would be playing around with her smartwatch, and Kirat would then get messages from Bobby at that time, implying that, of course, that Simran, while she was with other people, including Kirat in this case, while she was with other people, she's messaging Kirat as Bobby. So the only explanation I have for this is that essentially she didn't have a life outside of perhaps work, getting her grades, and even during the time that she was with Kirat and others, that she was still playing this character. So thanks very much for your question, Fish Cheeks. Next question is from Esther. Did JJ really die? So I didn't make this particularly clear in my video about this, so let me just clarify here. And JJ isn't mentioned at all in the documentary. So, but if you listen to the podcast, then you'll know what the answer to this question is. But the short of it is, no, JJ did not die. So JJ was the younger brother of Bobby. Bobby did have a real younger brother called JJ. But the JJ that was messaging Kirat at the beginning of the podcast, and who apparently also died from some allergic reaction or what have you, no, he didn't die. He didn't. That was just Simran playing JJ, and another case of her sort of garnering sympathy for essentially a fictional character or a fictional version of a real person. So thanks very much for your question, Esther. Third question, guys, is from, I think that's Ale Jazz. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm sorry if I'm not. The question is, how did Simran know Kirat met Bobby in the club? And Kirat met Bobby in the club. This is kind of glossed over in both the documentary and the podcast. No mention is made of what happened after that initial actual meeting with the real Bobby in Brighton with Kirat. I don't really know what happened. I don't know how Kirat would have brought that up with the online Bobby who was Simran. I don't know exactly what happened after that, how that was played off. But yeah, not much is really said about that. It would have been nice if it was addressed somewhere, but I haven't really seen it anywhere. So how did Simran find out that Kirat had met Bobby in the club? She probably told her. Kirat probably got online and spoke to the online Bobby, and then mentioned, oh hey, I saw you in the club perhaps. And just to mention, this is all speculation. I don't actually know what happened, but yeah, I'm sure it was mentioned, and then Simran probably just played it off and found some way to pretend like, oh yeah, I was drunk perhaps, or I was, I was not quite in a right state of mind, or maybe I was feeling shy, whatever it is. But it's all speculation at this point. We don't really have an actual answer for what happened between Kirat and the online Bobby when they were chatting after that meeting with the actual real Bobby. So yeah, thanks very much for your question, El Jazz. Next question is from Nasr Zaman, who says, why didn't Kirat's mother at least try and meet Bobby's mother? I mean, that's how it works in Asian culture. Didn't they say Bobby's family was from West London? I don't know if there was any mention of Bobby's family being from West London. I thought that they were from Kenya. So yeah, I don't really know about that. Maybe that's one of the things that made it difficult for the families to actually meet up. But I don't know if they were actually in West London. This is one of those questions. I mean, one of the things is that, well, how is it that nobody made any effort to meet Bobby's family? Why didn't that happen? And actually, in one of the podcasts that's dropped recently yesterday, and I might make a separate video on that. Kirat talks a little bit. She expands on some of the stuff that was not mentioned in the podcast or the documentary about sort of, well, how is it that you live in the same sort of community, and that there's no sort of go-between between Bobby's family and your own. But the short of it is that I think Bobby's family was in Kenya, and why there wasn't more of an effort for the parents to contact each other or for the families to get in touch, given that they were apparently in a relationship. I don't actually know what happened there. All right, guys, last question that I'm going to go through here is from Kezabel. So what was Simran's motivation? That's the part I don't understand. And there's a second very similar question from Caramel, which says, what kind of cousin does that? What kind of person does that? I mentioned that, while I was listening to the podcast, that the first thing that I thought about was the dark tetrad. So the dark tetrad is an expansion of the dark triad, and dark triad is made up of Machiavellianism, narcissistic personality disorder, and psychopathy. And to that they added sadism, which is essentially taking pleasure in torturing people. The sense I get from somebody like Simran is that she enjoyed this. It does mention elsewhere, actually, that, she would be having panic attacks over the phone and be crying down the phone. And Simran is, online Bobby in this case, is just sort of listening to this and doesn't seem perturbed by this, doesn't seem moved by the fact that she's hurting somebody and that she's hurting this person quite badly. Is there an element of sadism here that she's enjoying manipulating people, enjoying playing with somebody, enjoying seeing just how much she can put this person through and still have them come back to her time and time again. Again, that's possible. I'm not a clinician, I'm not an expert. This is just, based on my sort of, I'm a guy on the internet and this is what I'm thinking. The second thing, of course, might very well be sex. How much did sex play in this? I mean, the thing with that is that Kirat's apparent relationship with Bobby doesn't really start till 2015 and ends 3 years later in 2018 once, she meets the real Bobby in Brighton. And she'd first started chatting or gotten her first message from the online Bobby, Simran, in 2010. So this was going on for 5 years before we got to any point where they're meant to apparently be in some sort of, actual romantic relationship. Was it a sex thing at some point? I mean, at some point, but why then would it take that long for it to get to that point? The sense I get that this is much more about manipulation. This is much more about power. This is much more potentially about sadism. This might be more about getting off on that idea of being able to control someone. And, Kirat herself has when asked about sort of, some of the more sordid details of this, has pushed back. And you saw in the Netflix documentary, when you saw it, she was asked this question. She said, well, that's not an appropriate question. That is her choice. She's coming from a Punjabi Sikh socially conservative community. She's trying to kind of walk a tightrope with that. And I don't necessarily blame her for taking that tact with that. The last thing that I think maybe nobody else has mentioned, or at least I'm not aware of anyone else mentioning it, but I did think about this. Don't forget that Bobby, online Bobby, died. right? So he got shot in Kenya, and then he died, and then whatever it was, I don't know how long, a couple of weeks or what have you. He ends up coming back to life, right? And then he's in witness protection. Of course, anyone out that's looking from the outside in is going to look at that and say, well, that's a quite ridiculous story. But I wonder, that kind of stuck with me. The fact that Simran killed off Bobby and then brought him back to life. Was that her attempt to end this? Was that her attempt to end this? Apparently, Simran's justification for how awful she was to Kirat was to say, well, I kept pushing her and hurting her to essentially push her away. And I was like, I don't necessarily believe that. The sense I get more is that she was maybe enjoying this. She was enjoying the manipulation and the hurt that she was causing Kirat more than she was, trying to push her away and try and end it. Because if she wanted to end it, she could have just killed Bobby and then made him stay dead. Or, kill him off a second time and then really he would stay dead. Is it the case that, and this goes back to the question of like the first question, which was like, well, how the hell did she rise to become an executive at a major bank and, have this cast of 60 characters and have a relationship with her cousin and all the rest of it? Well, an addiction is something that affects your ability to meet your obligations. An addiction is something that affects the rest of your life. Is it affecting your sleep? Is it affecting your work? Is it affecting your personal relationships? Is it something that is spilling over into the rest of your life? And of course, the sense I get is, this was spilling over all over Simran's life. There's the story in the podcast about how Simran apparently, I think, didn't go to her own bachelorette party, her own hen do, because she had to make a phone call to the US apparently. Now, was she on a call to Kirat or somebody else? I mean, possibly. It was spilling over to the rest of her life. To spend this amount of time, how many hours did she sink into this? It does look like it has some of the hallmarks of an addiction. Is it the case that she had an addiction to this, to creating this online world, but also the darker parts of it, which is, the manipulation and maybe potentially the sadism and causing a bit of hurt, and seeing just how far she could take it? Because I'm not buying that she tried to end it by treating Kirat horribly. I think she was treating Kirat horribly because she wanted to. If she wanted to end it at any point, she could have said, oh, well, because she'd had the other cast of characters that she'd call upon to say, well, very sad now, Bobby died. Bobby had a stroke. Bobby had a heart attack. Bobby had a whatever. It doesn't matter. You could have killed off this guy. So, and maybe it's just the fact that I'm looking too much into that fact that she killed him off and then brought him back. This looks to me like somebody who's like, oh, I need to stop this. I don't know, I'll put the alcohol in the, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head, I'll put the alcohol in the garage where it's more difficult for me to get to rather than in the fridge or in the cupboard in the kitchen. And then a few days later being like, well, actually, no, I'm going to go to the garage and I'm going to pick it up and I want to put it back in the fridge or the cupboard so it's much more accessible. This is somebody who can't control themselves. This is somebody who has an addiction to whatever it is that she's doing. And once again, this is all speculation. I have no idea. We don't really know. There's only one person that knows why Simran did this. There's only one person, that's Simran herself. But yeah, those are my thoughts. All right, guys. So I decided to actually include a little bit in this video about what was said on the podcast that was dropped yesterday in an interview with Kirat herself, which is about an hour and 45 minutes. It's quite long, so if you want sort of a supplementary to the podcast and the documentary, if you're just looking to hear more about Kirat's side of the story and what wasn't included in either of those two kinds of media, then you can look into that. I'll pop a link to that in the description as well, so you can go see it as well. But a few things are mentioned in this podcast. Here it says that there have been other victims of Simran. So Kirat was not the only person that she'd done this to. And this, I wonder, this goes back to my sort of idea about sort of addiction. Like, this was not something that Simran was just doing to one person. She'd done it to others, but they haven't necessarily spoken out. So Kirat said that this person, exists. They're there. It has been mentioned somewhere, but it's not been. They've not come out and spoken, of course, as publicly as Kirat has herself. And there's also kind of a question about, well, what else is Simran like in her public and her professional life and her personal life? Kirat, of course, after what happened, is reassessing some of the things that she that were said to her by Simran. So Simran might say, well, there was this person at work, and I had to put them in their place because they're this annoying person at work that goes around annoying people, and I put them in their place, sort of thing. And I wonder about, and again, I'm not a clinician, but I think about those sort of dark tetrad traits that mean that people, like to take a bit of joy in manipulating people or bullying people, what have you. And I wonder, especially for somebody who works as an executive at a bank, that climbed that ladder, I wonder if there are any stories at work of Simran and what kind of her behavior is like. But that story takes on a kind of a different dimension once you find out that Simran was Bobby, because it might very well have been that Simran was just bullying people. That she's not particularly pleasant in her professional life as well. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see what, if anything, comes out about that. So here was an interesting thing. So one of the things that Kirat mentions on this interview, in this podcast that came out the other day, was that she actually spoke to some family member. This was an aunt or something like that, and she'd spoken to this family member, and this was somebody who knew Kirat and who also knew Bobby and his family. And this aunt apparently said that the family lives in Bristol, which is not accurate. Of course, Bristol is not the same city as Brighton. They both begin with B. But apparently, Kirat says that she put Bobby on the phone to this family member, and this family member themselves didn't figure out themselves that this was not the real Bobby, even with whatever voice Simran had been putting on at that time. But Kirat makes the point on the podcast. She says, well, if you can't figure out and the guy, the family, then how am I meant to figure it out? Just another kind of interesting thing that came out in this podcast was that Kirat says that when she first went to the police station, she went with Simran. I mean, she didn't know at this point that Simran was the online Bobby that she'd been speaking to, but she went with Simran. And when she went to the police station, Kirat knew the officer behind the desk because she'd apparently done some work with the local police station or with local police force in the local community. And so they were sort of catching up a bit while she was, about to go to the police about this whole thing. And a very interesting little point that Kirat makes. She says that Kirat gave her personal phone to Simran, and then Simran goes into the phone and then deletes the real Bobby's number. So when Kirat went to Brighton, this is just after what happened in Brighton, the real Bobby gave his number to Kirat. And now that they're at the police station in London, Kirat has given her personal phone to Simran, and Simran has deleted that number. Ostensibly enough, I would think, because she doesn't want them two talking. She doesn't want the real Bobby and Kirat to be communicating with each other, which says to me that even at this point, she's still kind of trying to keep this thing going. She's still thinking that she can get out of it. I don't know how long after it was that Simran ends up making her confession, both to Bobby and to Kirat. But that's quite interesting. She was still trying to remain in control of this thing. She was still going to try and get out of it. She, at this point, she had no intention of coming clean. I mean, especially when you're at a police station. I guess she didn't want the police, I don't know, getting on the phone to Bobby then. But yes, there's something about Simran. Like, she's even at this point, she's still manipulating. She's still trying to find a way out of it. A little bit later, when Kirat then goes back to the police station, and of course she knows now what has happened and that Simran is behind the entire thing. She ends up speaking to a female officer. I'm guessing it's the same female officer that was mentioned in the podcast who was a bit more sympathetic to Kirat. And this female police officer apparently said to Kirat that, well, if this had been a man that had done this, then, you would probably have an easier time with getting it investigated, or you would have much more sympathy. And, Kirat herself says on the podcast, she says, well, that one of the reasons why she believes that the community are not behind her is because, well, it's a Punjabi Sikh girl. So it's somebody within the same community. Had it been somebody else, had it been somebody outside of that community, then, well, perhaps they would be behind her, because it would be seen as, I guess, as one of their own being hurt by somebody outside. But that's not what it is. It's somebody within the community. And of course, yeah, it's her cousin. It's her female cousin. So yeah, that was quite sad to hear, but also probably true as well. Just an extra couple of tidbits as well that were mentioned on that podcast, which just to give you an idea of just how far Simran had kind of gone in keeping up this facade. So while Bobby was in hospital in the US somewhere, Kirat was trying to figure out which hospital he was at, and then had decided to send some flowers. So Kirat did actually send these flowers. So these flowers ended up at some hospital somewhere in the US, I think on the West Coast. And I can't imagine what it's like for the people that were there at the hospital. Some flowers showed up, and people were like, well, who are these flowers for? But anyway, the flowers showed up, and sometime later, Kirat ends up getting back some sort of gift. I don't know if it was a mug or something. Some sort of gift that references the message that Kirat had sent in the flowers to the hospital. So, there are a number of things going on that that were used by Simran to kind of keep up this facade, to keep this whole thing going. Kirat also seems to take a bit of issue with the way that her meeting in Brighton was kind of portrayed. She says that in the Netflix documentary, she seems to be banging on the door of Bobby's family's home, and she's, I just kind of knocked, and then, I walked away, and she didn't take too kindly to that. She also said that there was the point made about sort of she saw the child, the baby, the boy, as a kind of a stepson, and she's as a stepson, and she said that she did, but she also said that when I think it was Sanj that came out with the baby boy, she said, can you take him back inside, because I don't want him to see this. So I think Kirat was trying to sort of make the point that she did care about the well-being of at least the child and the family. So she didn't want him to hear whatever was going to happen next during this absolutely crazy conversation. So I guess one of the final questions is sort of, well, what does Kirat actually want from all of this? She mentions earlier on in this podcast, by the way, that she's not really looking to be sort of an activist. She could start a podcast or a YouTube channel on this particular topic, but it doesn't sound like that's what she wants. She's back in radio, which is great. That's something that she gave up while she was in this relationship with this online Bobby. But it's interesting because later on, she's kind of asked the question, like, what is it? What is it that you want? And she says that what she really wants is to change the rhetoric around victims. She says that, well, a number of people who have come to her from the Punjabi Sikh community that have said that some things have happened to them, and not necessarily catfishing or anything like that, but certain things have happened to them, and they don't speak out about it because there are certain taboos. Of course, socially conservative communities, that's the way that's going to be. So yeah, it may be that she's on something of a small mission, not necessarily making this her life, but I think that she does want to make some changes, I think, within the Punjabi Sikh community as well, and possibly legislation. We'll see if anything changes with this, if there will be any changes to the catfishing laws in the UK. So thank you so much for getting to the end of this video, guys. Please, like, share, and subscribe, and all that stuff. It helps my channel grow, and I want to keep making this kind of content. This is probably going to be the last video that I make on Sweet Bobby, I think. I'm going to be having a Halloween video coming up soon. A very cool story. You might have heard the Battersea Poltergeist, so I'll be going through that. And I really liked storytelling, and I really liked actually recounting the story of Sweet Bobby in my last video. That did fairly well. So yeah, watch this space. I'm going to be putting out more content, and I hope to see you again next time. Do take care of yourselves. Goodbye.